Good morning. This is Jason Dean at Film Fanatic headquarters. It's about 9:41 on a Friday morning. Hope everyone's doing good. Hope everyone is looking forward to hopefully a great weekend. So, yeah, this is a show that's going to be focused on James Cameron. It's kind of centered around all the recent news. Next week, the new Avatar movie is coming out, The Way of Water. And I've also started doing a new series where I'm going to be covering only two movies in the franchise, but the Alien franchise. And my next show, yesterday I put up a show where I focused on Ridley Scott's 1979, classic, my favorite science fiction horror movie of all time, Alien. I did a show on that yesterday, and I posted that. Thanks again for people checking out the channel. The numbers keep growing, and it's been a blast. I've been learning lots of new things as I go, trying to mix things up. And this is one of those shows where I've been doing a few things of where I've been doing these more specialty shows where I'm focusing on maybe one or two specific things. I did a show where I did coverage of my favorite director of all time, Stanley Kubrick. I also did a show that was centered around media, social media platforms, and I tied that in with reviews and movies that are affected by really negative reviews or press, and then also fan backlash that is now magnified through social media, Facebook, Instagram, all those kinds of things. And where the movies, certain films get that or go through the ringer and then eventually find an audience. And it was mostly, that show was most, film wise, that show is mostly centered on the Halloween Ends movie. And then also some other films that have kind of been in that same arena. The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. And I did another show, another specialty show where I talked all about just film scores and composers, my favorite soundtracks, and also some of the films that that are my favorite, my biggest kind of inspiration as far as just in general, but mostly for being a songwriter, for my band Quantum. And so I talked about just those kinds of things with that video, and that came out a few weeks ago. So try to mix things up. So this is a show that's going to be focused on James Cameron. The next show I'm going to be doing, like I had said, is going to be in the Alien series. Is going to be Aliens, which was directed by James Cameron. So I have a lot of James Cameron on my brain right now. And there's, all of this talk and hype about the new Avatar movie that's coming out next week, which is the follow-up to Avatar, the first one, which is going to be the first of, I believe, 5 movies, which is completely insane. And Avatar, directed by James Cameron and written by James Cameron, was the biggest movie of all time. The biggest, it made more money in the box office than any other movie in history, and it still holds on to that title by quite a huge margin. So obviously there's going to be lots of coverage and lots of press around this film, and it opens next week. So being that I'm in the James Cameron world now, in the process of putting together this new show where I'm going to be talking about Aliens by James Cameron, and also with the new Avatar movie coming out. This morning I just watched an interview with Chris Gore, who's a real famous figure in film reviews. He has a YouTube channel. He's also involved with movies, I believe, to a big capacity. He's produced movies. He's also been a pretty big figure in the actual film industry, but he's probably most well known for being a reviewer, and he's got a lot of clout in the business. He's very cynical, but I agree with a lot of his work and a lot of his reviews of things and his critique of the film industry as a whole. There's certain things I don't agree with what he kind of stands for to a degree or talks about, but that's the beauty of it. We can't all have the same opinion, and nor should we. It should be, like I've said before, the world would be pretty boring if everybody had the same opinion. The thing that would be nice in our culture, that would be nice, that I would love to see change. It won't ever. It's probably going to get worse, but would be the way people can express their differing, their differences in their opinions in a more kind of civil, respectful way. That I don't really think is happening. I think Chris Gore does a pretty good job of doing that. So anyway, yeah, I wanted to talk about James Cameron. He's a director who's been around for so long. I mean, kind of he's been a part of American cinema and American culture for as long as I can remember. Growing up, watching the Terminator movies, watching Aliens. I mean, he was probably one of the first directors. The Abyss is another one. But starting out, I feel like he was definitely as far as an action director, and particularly around like science fiction, he was a maverick. Or to a degree, I think he still is. I still think he is a maverick. He was when he came onto the scene. He did he set the bar so high, especially with films with like the Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. One of the greatest sci-fi movies ever. I've seen people review that movie even recently, and they kind of consider that film to be a sci-fi slasher film, meaning that Schwarzenegger's character as the Terminator, or the Hunter Killer, follows the same basic storyline of like the classic slasher type, the mass killer. And I can definitely understand that. I don't really consider that to be a slasher movie, but I can see that it definitely has that formula to it. I think because it's so apart, it's so everything is so invested in this like science fiction universe, and especially and then also with Sarah Connor's character, the female hero of the story, has such an arc and has such a strong will that for me personally, I feel like it does take it out of the slasher genre to a degree, and it has a different tone. But I can see it also to a degree fitting in that style. But I basically look at that as just one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever. Um, and probably my favorite film that James Cameron's ever directed is Aliens. I just think that is a masterpiece. I think it's arguably, and well, in my book, I think it's probably the greatest like sequel and follow up to an iconic movie, Alien. I think it's the greatest. I can't really say. I mean, there are lots of good sequels out there, but a lot of the times it's pretty rare. But I just think what James Cameron did with Aliens was completely exceptional. He was able to really pay tribute to the original film, but then give you something more. And James Cameron's known for being a visionary, obviously inventing technology that years later, for all of these films, for all of his films, Aliens, Terminator, and The Abyss, where he's created various forms of technology and for his films and his productions that were, many, many years using technology and creating technology that was light years ahead of where technology was at that time. And later on, it's always been other filmmakers when technology was maybe a little bit more expensive or became a little bit more readily available. They used a future or I should say directors after that followed him and films that followed after him. They adopted and adapted a lot of his techniques that he used, especially around technology. So in that way, I mean, I feel like he was a real maverick, and really uh, a real innovative voice in as far as using technology. And so Terminator, the Abyss, I think is another great movie. Uh, he's made some really great films. There's an interesting parallel though, I feel, with between like his career to a degree, and also between James Cameron. I feel like there's a parallel between James Cameron and George Lucas in a lot of ways. I feel the similarities are, you have these two iconic filmmakers, but I kind of get the sense that they acquired so much notoriety and so much financial backing that at one point they lost their vision, and they became kind of megomaniacal to a degree, where they became so uncompromising, which in the early stages of their career is is commendable. But I felt like with all of the success that both of these directors have had, and they've gotten older, they've kind of gotten increasingly more megomaniacal, and they don't really care, even though they have a huge fan base. Both directors, they don't really care about that, and they become more and more self-centered, I feel, to a degree, as filmmakers, to where they are, kind of notorious for the control that they want over their products. I mean, for instance, like with George Lucas, you know, obviously creating THX, an amazing movie with Robert Duvall, one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever. A movie that is really underappreciated. It's really overlooked. And then obviously the Star Wars trilogy, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Iconic movies. I'm a Empire Strikes Back guy. The But years and years later, with the release, now, you fast forward, 30 years or so, and now technology, CGI is a thing, and the technology is now readily available to create these multiple verses, and where these filmmakers are invested in world building. And that was, the period where George Lucas re-released all three movies: Star Wars: A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. And what he did is he basically, added all of these scenes, and used copious amounts of CG, added new characters. He edited the film in a different way. And there was also a thing of where he basically took the original cuts of the original films, and there was a time where if you were a Star Wars fan, and the beloved films that you grew up watching, you couldn't get them anymore. You couldn't get the original cuts. You couldn't get the original cut, say, of Empire Strikes Back, or the original cut of A New Hope. He basically took it upon himself to take all of that off the market, and basically, ban it. And so now the only releases that you're able to get of those original movies were these newer, quote unquote enhanced versions. And he felt like, in his mind, that these were the definitive versions, like, that represented what, his what it was his true represent. These films now were the true representation of the worlds that he wanted there to be. But now with technology, he was able to create these things. So when Lucas took these actions, there was an incredible fan backlash, where people were kind of outraged that the fans of Star Wars were outraged that that now you couldn't find the original editions, like the original versions of the films that, were just classic cinema, and they were, integral parts of, people's psyche growing up, having that film experience. Now you couldn't get those versions. You could only see the remastered versions with all of the new CGI cuts. So there was an incredible amount of backlash, and there was so much of a backlash that eventually, years later, George Lucas released those films, and he, to a degree, the fans, from the fans' perspective, and his kind of self-centeredness around it was, he was giving. I kind of feel like, looking back, I kind of felt like he was giving the middle finger to his base, and he just didn't care. I mean, he obviously had amassed, those films were a phenomenon, and he obviously had one of the largest, you know, probably probably the biggest fan base, in the world, and he really alienated himself by making those actions, or taking those actions where suddenly those versions weren't available. And over time, there was a lot of backlash, and eventually he made those available again. And since then, he's had, control with the all of the prequels, and he obviously, I felt, doesn't really care about any real shred of consistency. I felt like he kind of got lost in this world to a degree with all of the stardom that he had, and really went out of his way to kind of alienate the audience. And I feel and also this created this pushback against the films that started his career and put him on the map as a serious filmmaker. And he's always said that after he retired, fast forward, he eventually sold the entire franchise to Disney. And he always said, he's said for many years that he was going to return back into making, art house films. He always considered THX to be an art house film, and he wanted to kind of return to that world. And obviously, he hasn't done that at all. So, and the thing with James Cameron is, I feel like with, with what he's kind of, I feel like and to a degree, there's the same behavior to a degree, where he's amassed so much power and wealth, and again, without disrespecting either of those filmmakers, I feel like he's lost sight of where he kind of came from. I feel like he's lost sight of the audience, and I feel like to a degree he's got so, as a filmmaker, has gotten so self-centered that it's kind of clouded his vision and his methods onto, to making great movies. I feel like, I don't know, it goes, to me, it like goes back to the classic Spider-Man saying, or the classic Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And I feel like, to a degree, yeah, obviously an artist doesn't need to curate their work towards a fan base, or, they need to create their pieces of art, or their content, that's hopefully going to satisfy them first. But that being said, I feel like what their actions and their reactions towards the fans, where they've kind of gone out of the way to push that aside, and to kind of alienate that audience and that base, like almost purposely, because I feel like they've acquired so much wealth and power and clout, that that's all that matters, and they don't care about what anybody else thinks, and they're willing to kind of alienate their audience. So in some ways, I feel like there's a parallel between those two directors, even though I feel they're obviously, in their time, have done, they've done groundbreaking work. They set the bars incredibly high, but I feel like they've lost the essence of where they started, as being really great filmmakers and great storytellers. And up until Avatar came out, Titanic, James Cameron's other movie starring Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, was the biggest. That had made the that was the biggest money making movie of all time. And then Avatar eventually came out, and I feel like Titanic is good in some respects, and in some other aspects it's okay. It's a pretty mixed bag. I think some aspects of that film are really great. I overall like that film probably more than say Avatar. The thing with Avatar, and again, these are all my own personal opinions, my own personal observations. Oh, and when I was talking about getting back to what I feel the parallels are between George Lucas and and James Cameron, the last obviously the Terminator became a huge series, and not really a huge fan of those movies. The first one I feel is just incredible, but I feel like the rest of those films, even to a degree Terminator 2, I think it's a cool movie in a lot of ways as far as the technology, but I feel like a lot of the weight of the first movie and the sense of where there's a lot riding, there's a lot on the line, there's a sense of danger, and it doesn't have a completely commercial appeal. I feel like that's been lost with all of the other films. I feel like they've gotten watered down progressively more and more over the years, and it became a cash cow, and they're very forgettable films. The vision was the original vision and the original kind of mythology of and storyline, plot line of the original Terminator, just kind of washed over, and everything is kind of glazed over and kind of dumbed down to a degree. But there was a real interesting thing that happened a couple of years ago when the last Terminator movie came out, Dark Fate. It came out in 2019, and it was directed by Tim Miller. Originally, James Cameron was going to direct it, but he acted as a producer and a co-writer. And there were a bunch of writers on that film. And originally, I believe James Cameron was going to direct it, but he got Tim Miller to direct it, and Tim Miller was the director of Deadpool, which is an amazing film, just such an amazing film. But that movie was a commercial failure, and I've seen a lot of interviews. I've seen that film too, and again, it was one of those. I felt like it was really watered down to a degree. It felt like it took it tried to glaze over and try to water down the levity of the situation, and they tried to make it a commercial film, and tried to make it into this more of a popcorn film where I felt it just didn't carry the weight, and it was kind of ridiculous. But there's interviews with Tim Miller, who I think is great and an amazing artist in a lot of ways, where he struggled with James Cameron, where right up until the film was released, as far as cuts, and he was refusing to compromise at all. And being that he was James Cameron, he kind of usurped the whole movie and was so steadfast into what he wanted to see at the end of the day. So there was this tension constantly between those two filmmakers, Tim Miller and James Cameron, and overall James Cameron won that battle, and he had final cut of that film. And there's a really interesting interview that I think is still online with Tim Miller, where he talks about all of this tension, and where he just there was so many people involved with the process of writing that film, and James Cameron just like came in and just kind of took over, and he was refusing to compromise in any way, shape, or form, because he felt like his way was the only way, his vision was the only vision. And combining that with numerous cooks in the kitchen, meaning writers, all at the same table, he was unwilling to compromise, and he was coming from a place of where I feel, well, he's James Cameron. Everything he touches is box office gold, and so he can do anything. And I felt like that's the kind of perspective that I got listening to that interview. And Tim Miller was just like, in this interview, he was just like, at the end of it, he was just done, and he checked out. And he's like, I can't. This is too frustrating. And I highly recommend people out there, if you get a chance, search out that interview. It's really interesting, and after reading, or actually after listening to this interview, it made me think even more about the parallels between George Lucas and James Cameron, to where both of these figures have amassed empires, and I think with that, it's kind of clouded their judgment, and they increasingly got more insular with their vision, to where they were unwilling to compromise, to the point of where they were unwilling, or to the point to where they didn't care if they were completely alienating their base, their audience. So in that way, I think there's similarities. And as far as Avatar goes, like the campaign when that movie came out, when the first Avatar came out, it's hard to believe that came out about 15 years ago. When that movie was launched, the campaign for that film was unprecedented because of the budget, and it was the new James Cameron movie. He was following it up. I believe it was after. It had been years and years since he had put out a movie, and the last film he had done was Titanic, which was like this, just the biggest box office thing in the galaxy. So the hype machine and the press, all the press junkets were just outrageous, and all of the coverage of this movie. And when Avatar came out, obviously it, I don't know how many billions of dollars worldwide. Like, it was embraced by the whole world, over tenfold. I mean, it just set records everywhere. And then it went on to become the biggest box office movie in world history, and still remains the king of the box office. And so when Avatar came out, like everybody and their grandmother, I did go see it in the theater. And I remember going to see it. It was back in the day when people were, when there was a new movie coming out that, had a lot of press, people were really excited about it. You would wait in line, and I remember during that period, it's hard to believe it's 10 or 15 years ago, but that was back in the day, before streaming. And it was a time where, the theater going experience was a real celebratory, thing to do. So everybody and their grandmother would go to the movies. And I remember always during that time, not just Avatar, but when I go to the movies, like, it was tradition where you would go to a movie, say on a Friday night or a Saturday night. And, it was a scramble to find a seat, because it was usually sold out or close to being sold out. And on opening nights, Fridays or Saturdays, generally it would be a full house. So it was like a really cool experience. And that was like commonplace back then, where people were, chomping at the bit to see this new movie. And so it became an outing. Everybody, the whole family would go to a movie. I remember having that experience all the time, going to see, the amazing original Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies. Like, it was such an experience to go and wait in line and go into this dark room, and it'd be, hundreds of people there, and everybody would be excited, and, it would be like this real collective, and it was just such a cool experience. And now when I go to the theaters, I still love going to the theater, but I don't go nowhere as near as I used to. Now it's like, I mean, the last time I saw a movie in the theater was probably, summertime. So it's been a long. I think one of the last movies I saw was Jordan Peele's Nope, which was like in July, and I think I've seen something since then. And here we are in December, and it's like, it's crazy. Like, but I remember even seeing that movie, and it was an amazing film, and it was great to see it on the big screen. Like, it was still, that experience was amazing. But all of the other factors were not there. Like, there was no line. People were not, congregating and excited to go. It was pretty dismal. That part of the experience was kind of depressing. It would be, I'd go, the times I've gone to the movies, like the last 2 years, go to the movies now. It's like I'll get a couple of friends to go, or sometimes I'll go by myself, but sometimes I'll get a little group of friends, and we're kind of the only people in the theater, and it's not like this experience. Like a lot of the times, like even I remember going to see the Batman, the movie with Robert Patterson, seeing that in the theater, and that movie made a tremendous amount of money. It's as far as Hollywood goes, and I really wanted to see it, and I saw that in the theater, and there was we went. I went with two other friends, and there was like maybe four other people in the theater, and it was opening weekend. And granted, we saw it on an off day, but still, it was weird. Like there was nobody there. And then other movies that I've seen in the theater where I have gone to see it on a Friday or Saturday, it's kind of the same experience. It's like I've even gone to big theaters and having and that same kind of thing happened. It's just there's not that excitement, and it's all due to streaming and COVID and all this other crap. But I think it's mostly due to the streaming services and the streaming platforms. Like that was not a thing 15 years ago. Say when Avatar came out, it wasn't a thing, and you can't technology grows at this exponential rate. You can't suddenly take it and be like, well, it's kind of overriding our system or overtaking, so we need to like fold it up and put it in a box and or bury it, and maybe it won't come out up again. You can't do that. You have to. There's a degree of like with technology, you have to. It's not going to stop. It's going to just keep growing. But there's also it's growing because it's not being forced onto people. It's because people are making those choices. They suddenly have these options at their computers now where they didn't have, that they didn't have before. And it's also the convenience of that. It's for artists and musicians, and I see it too. I'm a musician, so I see it, and I have albums, you know, that I've put out over the years, and seeing now, like when we did our last Quantum album, In Dreams I Saw, Chapter 1, which was our first album, say, it's hard to believe the album before that, The Stars Beneath Our Feet, came out almost 4 years ago. So it had been a significant amount of time since our last album. And when we released this new album, I really noticed and saw that the landscape, just within a 4 year span, as far as how people access content, through films, like going to see films and seeing that kind of thing really depleted as far as turnouts. Movies are still making a tremendous amount of money. I mean, case in point, I still haven't seen it, but Top Gun Maverick, set a huge, huge record. But the new Spider-Man that came out last year set, global records too. So there's still, obviously, these films are making tremendous amounts of money, but it's a whole different model now. And for smaller filmmakers and smaller artists like myself, when I thought about putting out our new album, I had to really think about, okay, how do we do this? How do we market this? Because compared to 4 years ago, it's a whole different world as far as how people access their content or entertainment. So there were so many more variables, and trying to kind of understand it to a degree. So you can't stop that technology. You can't stop all of these choices and options. People are making their decisions on their own free will. Nobody is like holding a gun to their head. People are partaking or not, and people are partaking in it. But it's a way, I think, for musicians, artists, filmmakers, and whatnot. They have to, it's a case of having to just kind of adapt to what's happening. You can't stop it. So, but when I saw Avatar in the theater, it was a fun experience. But a day or two after I remember seeing it in the theater, I just kind of forgot about most of it. I thought from a visual standpoint, it was pretty breathtaking in a lot of ways. But I've had problems also with like with that to a degree. I felt like the color palettes were kind of all the same. Everything was like blue and green, and it felt like everything was the tones, like just say of the color palette was all the same. That being said, I thought visually it was still amazing. The action was pretty breathtaking at times. I didn't get a chance to see it in 3D. I heard that that was the way to see it, and I've seen it. You know, I have it on DVD, and I've seen it a bunch of other times. But the main thing that I had with that film, my main problem that I had with that film was that how, although there were aspects dealing with the Avatar nature and the the science fiction element, I thought were very interesting. The actual story I thought was completely unoriginal and completely silly. It was basically I kind of felt like that movie was literally it's based on it's Pocahontas. You know, it's the classic Pocahontas story, and then so I came away thinking, well, the story obviously for a movie to be good, it's got to have good characters, it's got to have a good story, even if it's not say well like a totally original story, it still has to be well executed, and I think it was to a degree in Avatar, but for me it was so impossible to get around the idea of how unoriginal it was because I felt like it was literally Pocahontas or Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves, like note for note storyline, but you put it in this futuristic sci-fi world. Like that's all it was. And but to me, it was like a direct ripoff of that. It wasn't inspired. It wasn't. There wasn't an there wasn't an aspect where they James Cameron took. And again, this is my opinion. I didn't think it was where there were parallels between the story or James Cameron took that classic story and took flavors from it and added it to the film. This was like no, this is literally the same movie but put into the science fiction universe. So for me it was so unoriginal and coming from James Cameron and how hyped that film was and how much money that movie made, I couldn't that got in the way and just it just overrode or just that got in the way so much to where I couldn't enjoy the film. I couldn't I couldn't really sit through it because I felt like it just it there just it just lacked so much originality there wasn't any. And the funny thing is, last year or a couple of years ago, I had seen and I do love those movies. I mean, they're classic stories. Pocahontas, obviously. I am a big fan of Kevin Costner's Dance with Wolves. But it was interesting because a few years ago I watched the Last Samurai, which was a samurai movie starring Tom Cruise. And the interesting thing is like if you watch Avatar and Dances with Wolves, Pocahontas, and The Last Samurai, if you watch those together, the storyline is like all four of those movies, and the originator being Pocahontas. If you look or watch all of those films in succession, they are and they're all one takes place obviously in the sci-fi world. One is a western. One is like an animated story. So they're set in these very different genres, but the storyline is literally the same. Like they're all exactly the same. Everything from the arcs of the characters to the tribal aspects to the culture to the whole idea of the white man coming in and destroying civilization and wiping out the natives whose land it was. Like literally, they were literally the same story. So because of that, I could never really I never felt vested or invested in Avatar, and because that's such a thing, I can't really understand why that movie is such a sensation, or went on to become a sensation. And this, like, I started off the show by saying, well, the idea of this is something I've been thinking about because I've been working on these videos, with aliens with James Cameron. So I've been thinking about James Cameron a lot. And then with the review that I saw today of Avatar: The Way of Water, the new Avatar movie that's coming out next week by Chris Gore. He did a little. He had just seen it in the theater. Was talking about it, but I saw this podcast or this thing on YouTube where he was being interviewed, and he said he started the conversation by talking about the film, but then there were other film reviewers also in this group, and he basically in a lot of ways kind of tore the film apart. He also said, at the same time that he felt it was like one of the most amazing film going experiences, but he also felt the dialogue was really terrible. There's these huge plot lines. He said that when he went to the premiere, there were people laughing at the dialogue in the film, and they were actually told to kind of be quiet. But he felt at the same time that the movie was kind of this transcending experience, more on the visual side. He said the action in the film was eclipsed any Marvel movie he had basically seen in years. So he had this real mixed bag. I'll probably see it, but I have reservations, but I'll probably see it. But I think, like, the thing that I took away from that interview the most, which I really disagreed, he was saying, and then so were the other people on the show. They were all saying, they said it multiple times where they felt, you know, they have not seen any good movies in like the last, they took, for instance, like the last 3 or 4 years, and they said they haven't really seen anything that's been great. And especially now in 2022 going into 2023, they haven't seen any movies that are, they feel are great, or are as good as movies that they saw 15 or 20 years ago. And they basically poo-pooed every film that's come out within the last few years that that's been released, that saying that they're all subpar and they're all crap. And I really don't believe that. I think there's been some movies that have come out that are just tremendous. Pearl, X is another movie. Men, directed by Alex Garland. The other film's directed by Ty West. There's a film called Loosh that I saw a couple of years ago that I think is just an incredible film, totally underrated. The Northman, I think, is a really incredible movie. Suicide Squad, just an amazing film. The Black Phone, I think, is an incredible film. Everything Everywhere All at Once, amazing film, one of the greatest films ever that just came out this year. So many great movies have come out just within the last year. So I don't agree. I don't, in that aspect, I totally agree with that notion of where people are continually saying that there's nothing good anymore coming out, and I think that's absurd and ridiculous. But again, it's a matter of opinion. But going into Avatar 2, I think it's gonna probably set, huge records. But I don't know. It's like I wasn't really excited. I'll probably watch it again to give it a chance. But that's a movie I've seen quite a few times, and I've seen it with a mindset of like, okay, maybe something will click differently, or I'll get something else out of it. And it's a long movie, and I from what they say for this new one, it's 3.5 hours long, and the original is about 3 hours long. And I every time I've seen it, again, visually, there's some aspects to it that are really great. I think there's some amazing action sequences. There are things about that film I think are really great, but the story, I feel, that's the main red light for me. I can't wrap my brain around it, and the lack of originality. But this film will probably go on to make an unprecedented amount of money again, and there's going to be 5 of these films coming out, which is just completely mind-boggling and insane. So again, this was just a show where I wanted to talk about James Cameron, the idea of where, in my own mind and my thoughts of as to where like his career has gone, and also, the idea of certain directors, iconic directors who amass all of this power and have the keys to the kingdom and what they kind of do with it, and where I feel like everything kind of gets misdirected, and their visions and their views of their own audience and the way they treat their audience, how I feel like it kind of gets corrupted in some ways. When you look back at their early stages of what they were doing as, visionary filmmakers, and also the nature of like hype and press about around things. When if you really look at it at face value, and again, it's just a matter of opinion, but if you look at it at real face value, and you like take all of the fireworks away and bells and whistles, and you look at it for what it is it really that good? And then a lot of the times, it's really not. It's got all this stuff and all these things going off, and all these people talking about it, and all these people spending money on it. But at the end of the day, if you look at it for what it is, there's a lot of other things out there that are actually really good. So this is Jason Dean, Film Fanatic. If you like this page, please like and subscribe. Thank you again for everyone's support, and we will see you next time. Peace.